Hi, and welcome back to Heimler's History. Woo! We had ourselves a good time in World War I, opening up to the world and all of its global affairs. But by the time the 1920s roll around, we're ready to get out of that relationship and just work on us for a little bit. Look, Europe, I just don't have room in my life for both of you. You and your drama. Look, it's not because I don't like you anymore. It's because I hate you. Look, my friends don't like you, and I can't exactly break up with them, so... Anyway, it was during this time that America decided to take a little time away from the relationship and figure our own selves out for a little while. And as it turns out, it was a decade of astonishing upheaval and enormous prosperity. So, if you're ready, I'm ready. Let's get to it.
It's time to kick it old school.
Okay, it's difficult to conceive just how much changed during the 1920s, but I think you'll get a sense of it if I just list them one after the other. That way you get a sense of the mounting craziness. First, there was the curbing of free speech and something called the Red Scare. So in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution happened over in Russia, and now they were all together communist. And if there's one thing good old red-blooded Americans hate, it's a communist. And so fearing that the commies would infiltrate America, guys like Mitchell Palmer took up crusades to purge America of its reds, which in general happened to be the liberals. Our fear of communism became so acute that we passed a series of laws which effectively shut people's mouths so that they could not advocate for violence as a means of social change, which, as it turns out, is a hallmark of communism. So do we really need free speech? Nah. Second, during this time, you've got the spawning of a new and revived Ku Klux Klan. In case you didn't know, this is a group of folks who dressed up in their bed sheets and banded around the following principles. They were anti-foreign, anti-Catholic, anti-black, anti-Jewish, anti-pacifist, anti-communist, anti-internationalist, anti-bootlegger, anti-evolution, anti-gambler, anti-adultery. Wait a minute, who's for adultery? And anti-birth control. But they didn't only organize based on what they were against. These guys were also for a few things too. The Ku Klux Klan were for things like whiteness and Protestantness and Native Americans. No, not those Native Americans. There it is. And I have to admit, sometimes it's hard to take these guys very seriously because they have the following real ranks in their organization. They have Imperial Wizards, Grand Goblins, and King Kriegels. And frankly, sometimes it's hard to know whether to fear these guys or to tell the Dungeon Master that you're ordering a full-blown melee on their Demigorgon. Third thing going on in the 20s, we closed that spigot on immigration. Not only were we tired of fighting on European soil, we had also grown tired of all those Europeans trying to find a home on our soil. So we get the Immigration Act of 1924, which squeezed the immigration quota down to 2%. And all of this ended an era of almost unrestricted immigration to the United States. Fourth, there was prohibition. You'll recall that women and churches have been crusading loudly and for decades to get that devil drink out of American hands. And the craziest part is that they crusaded so loudly that Congress passed a constitutional amendment, namely the 18th Amendment, abolishing the manufacture and sale of intoxicating liquors. But prohibitionists underestimated just how much Americans, and especially the European immigrants, loved their giggle sauce. They also failed to contend with just how difficult it would be to enforce a law which most Americans opposed. And so Americans didn't really stop drinking all that much, they just took their drinking underground. Secret bars called speakeasies sprang up dozens at a time in every town and city. Enforcement officers were bribed to the extreme, and all in all, prohibition, the last spasm of progressive impulse, was a failure. Fifth, there was a giant clash between anti-religious thought and religious thought. And all of this was concentrated on what became known as the Scopes monkey trial in 1925. So the story is, several states had made it illegal to teach Darwinian evolution in public schools. And Tennessee was one of those states, and it was a high school biology teacher by the name of John T. Scopes who decided he did not like that law very much and would teach Darwin anyway. Now, not surprisingly, his illegal shenanigans were made public and the trial was set. The case shouldn't have been that spectacular, but spectacular personalities showed up and made sure that this case became a national triumph for one side or the other. The famed criminal lawyer Clarence Darrow arrived to defend Scopes, and the oft-presidential hopeful William Jennings Bryan showed up to prosecute on behalf of what everyone was calling fundamentalist Christians. Long story short, Scopes was found guilty, but it didn't really matter because the lasting influence of the trial was that it cast doubt on the fundamentalists and their cause. Sixth, there was the rise of mass consumption. Henry Ford had perfected the assembly line and everybody fell in love with his Model T. And Henry Ford's manufacturing principles began to spread, and all of a sudden America is churning out manufactured goods like never before, and people are buying them like never before. And the good news is, ordinary people didn't even have to have the money to buy all of this stuff because of the rise of consumer credit. It was the rise of what the credit companies called possess now, pay tomorrow. Seventh, there was a revolution in entertainment. With the advent of radio and motion pictures, people were consuming sporting events at home, and politicians could now deliver their message to millions of people at a time instead of just thousands. Eighth, there was a revolution for the ladies. Margaret Sanger, who was a fierce feminist, organized a birth control movement which openly talked about using contraceptives. Women were finding freedom in the way they dressed, in the way they carried themselves, and case in point, the flappers. These women flouted tradition by cutting their hair short, smoking and drinking, and even showing their ankles in public. Ninth and finally, American literature was coming into its own in the form of something called modernism, which is a habit of thought which questions authority and conventions. You've got F. Scott Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby, Ernest Hemingway in A Farewell to Arms, William Faulkner in The Sound and the Fury, and mostly concentrated in the North, you had a proliferation of black authors coming into their own as well. This was a movement that became known as the Harlem Renaissance. You had Claude McKay and Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston. You put all this together and you had a decade that roared, sometimes in fury, sometimes in laughter, but a roar nonetheless. But the roar couldn't last forever. In fact, very soon, the roar will be reduced to a whimper by the great stock market crash of 1929. But we'll have to save that for another lecture. I'll see you next time.